Bile burned the back of my throat sharp and acidic, completely masking the taste of my mother's overcooked pot roast. I blinked. Once, twice. The suffocating weight of the crushed steering column, the agonizing crunch of my own ribs collapsing into my lungs was gone. The cloying stench of leaking antifreeze and my own copper-scented blood vanished, replaced by the smell of scorched gravy and cheap vanilla candles. My fingers, which a moment ago had been slick with gore, desperately clawing at a shattered windshield, were now resting softly on a white linen napkin. I sucked in a breath. It was a ragged, pathetic sound, but it filled lungs that were whole. "Did you swallow a bone?" Claire, my mother's voice, disapproving, clipped her fork, pausing halfway to her mouth. She was looking at me over the rim of her wine glass, her eyebrows pulled together in that familiar knot of perpetual disappointment. I didn't answer her. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the man sitting across the dining table. Dominic. He was smiling. It was that same slow, devastatingly practiced smile that had ruined my sister's life, bankrupted my parents, and ultimately put me in a shallow grave on the side of a rain-slicked highway. He looked exactly as he had the first time I met him, bespoke navy suit that fit a little too perfectly heavy gold watch peeking out from a French cuff hair swept back with effortless precision. Next to him sat my sister Sarah. She was practically vibrating with smugness, her hand resting heavily on his thigh, her engagement ring, a massive gaudy cubic zirconia he'd passed off as a flawless diamond, catching the dim light of the dining room chandelier. "I was just telling Dominic about your little accounting job, Claire." Sarah chimed in, her voice coated in that sugary, condescending tone she reserved exclusively for me. "He thinks it's cute how you stick to your spreadsheets. In my past life, this was the exact moment I took the bait. The moment I narrowed my eyes, offended, and asked Dominic exactly what he did for a living. That question had triggered his rehearsed monologue about international wealth management and offshore logistics. It had prompted me to start digging. I had spent weeks pulling public records, tracing shell companies, and burning the midnight oil to build a dossier to protect my sister. I had handed her the proof, and Sarah had taken my meticulous file straight to Dominic. She told him I was jealous. She told him I was trying to sabotage her happiness because I couldn't find a man of my own. 3 days later, my brake lines snapped on Devil's Peak. My chest gave a phantom throb. I looked at Sarah's glowing, flushed face. She was looking at me, waiting for the defensive snap, waiting for the jealousy she so desperately craved. I reached for my water glass. Condensation dripped down the side, freezing against my skin. The cold was grounding. It was real. I was 28 again. It was November 2018. I was alive. "Spreadsheets pay the bills," I said softly, my voice surprisingly steady. I offered Dominic a bland, empty smile. "But it's nothing compared to the big leagues. What is it you do again, Dominic?" Global equity structuring. Dominic purred. His voice was a low baritone designed to make people lean in. He picked up his fork, casually twirling a piece of roast. "Mostly emerging markets. We find undervalued assets overseas, inject capital and restructure for high-yield returns. It's high risk, but the dividends are—" He trailed off, looking at Sarah with a smoldering gaze. "Well, they allow me to spoil the people I care about." My father, sitting at the head of the table, leaned forward. I saw the familiar gleam of greed spark in his dull eyes. "High yield, you say?" "Oh, Daddy don't bore him with work talk." Sarah giggled, swatting Dominic's arm. But I saw the way Dominic's eyes tracked my father's interest. It was the look of a wolf noticing a lame sheep at the back of the flock. In the old timeline, I would have slammed my hands on the table. I would have pointed out that global equity structuring in emerging markets was a meaningless word salad. I would have demanded the name of his firm. Instead, I took a bite of my cold potatoes. They tasted like ash, but I chewed deliberately. It sounds incredibly complicated, I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, projecting nothing but dull-witted awe. You must be very smart. Sarah is lucky to have someone who can navigate all that. Dominic paused. His dark eyes flicked to me, calculating. Scammers are predators. They are hyper-tuned to micro-expressions looking for the skeptic in the room. He was probing me for resistance. When he found nothing but the vapid gaze of an unremarkable sister, his shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch. I'm the lucky one, Dominic said smoothly, kissing Sarah's temple. Sarah beamed, but I caught the slight tightening of her jaw. She was disappointed. She had wanted a fight. She had wanted me to seethe with envy, so she could lord her perfect catch over me. Well, my mother sighed, slicing into her meat with unnecessary force. It's nice to see Sarah finally settled. A mother worries, you know, especially when certain children. She didn't look at me, but the implication hung heavy in the stale air. Struggle to build a future. Claire's doing fine. Beatrice, my father muttered, though his attention was still entirely on Dominic. So, these offshore assets? Is that an open pool? Or institutional only? The hook was in. I watched the fishing line pull taut as Dominic gave a practiced, humble shrug. Usually institutional, sir. But I occasionally open a back door for friends and family. A private syndicate, if you will. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked. A heavy, rhythmic sound. It sounded like a countdown. I could save them. Right now I could overturn the table. I could scream. I could call the police, though they'd do nothing without proof. I could warn them. I looked at my mother, who had spent my entire life comparing me to Sarah. I looked at my father, who was already mentally spending money that wasn't his. And I looked at my sister, the woman who had watched me bleed out in a hospital bed in another life, and whispered, "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" I carefully dabbed my mouth with the linen napkin, hiding the ghost of a smile. "Could you pass the salt, Sarah?" I asked. I didn't warn her, and I never would. Rain hammered against the single-pane window of my cramped kitchen, obscuring the streetlights into blurry yellow smears. It had been 8 days since the dinner. 8 days of playing the oblivious, supportive background character in the tragicomedy of my sister's life. I stood by the counter, wrapping my hands around a chipped ceramic mug of cheap Earl Grey tea. The heat seeped into my palms, grounding me. I was waiting. The buzzer to my apartment screeched aggressive and impatient. 2 short blasts, 1 long. Sarah. I pressed the intercom button. "Come up. Door's unlocked." A minute later, the door swung open. Sarah marched in, shaking a dripping designer umbrella onto my scuffed hardwood floor. She smelled powerfully of expensive gardenia perfume and damp cashmere. She looked around my tiny living room, her nose crinkling in reflexive disgust at the second-hand sofa and the stack of utility bills on the coffee table. "God, Claire, it smells like boiled cabbage in here," she complained, dumping her designer tote on one of my dining chairs. It's the plumbing," I lied, taking a slow sip of my tea. "What brings you out in this weather?" Sarah sighed heavily, running a hand through her perfectly blown-out hair. She leaned against the counter, invading my space. "I just needed a break. Dominic is so stressed with his new acquisitions. His phone is ringing nonstop. Singapore, London, Dubai. It's exhausting just watching him. Sounds incredibly demanding. I said, infusing my voice with a dull, monotone sympathy. It is. But that's the price of success. She paused, her eyes darting to my face, looking for the jealousy. When she didn't find it, she shifted tactics. Actually, that's kind of why I'm here. Dad mentioned you had some CDs maturing this month. From Grandma's inheritance. My grip on the mug tightened. In the previous timeline, this was the moment she had cornered me. She hadn't asked. She had demanded. She had claimed I owed it to the family to invest in Dominic's syndicate, so Dad could secure a larger tier of returns. I had refused, sparking a massive family blowout where I was branded a selfish, small-minded failure holding them back. This time, my money was already gone. 2 days ago, I had broken the CDs early, taken the penalty, and quietly moved the entirety of my life savings into an obscure trust account under a newly formed LLC. I had even changed my primary banking institution. I was broke on paper. Untouchable. I did, I said softly, looking down at my tea. But I had to use it. Sarah froze. Used it on what? You haven't bought anything. You're still living in this box. Medical bills. I lied effortlessly. I tapped my chest. They found a benign shadow on my lung a few months ago. The out-of-pocket for the scans and the specialist wiped me out. I didn't want to worry Mom and Dad. Sarah stared at me, her jaw slack. Not with concern, but with profound, irritated disappointment. She didn't care about the phantom shadow on my lung. She cared that the cash was gone. You blew $30,000 on scans! She snapped, her voice pitching up. Claire, you have the worst financial sense of anyone I know. If you had given that to Dominic, he could have doubled it in 6 months, and you could have paid the stupid medical bills out of the interest. I know, I whispered, shrinking back, playing the pathetic victim. I panicked. I'm sorry, Sarah. I just don't have your head for these things. Or your courage. The flattery worked like a charm. Sarah's posture relaxed, her irritation smoothing out into condescending pity. Well, you always were overly cautious. It's fine. Dad is pulling from his 401k to meet Dominic's minimum buy-in anyway. I just thought I'd throw you a bone. My stomach performed a cold, slow roll. My father was draining his 401k. The lifeblood of his retirement built over 40 years of backbreaking middle management labor. Dominic was taking it all. That's so generous of you, I murmured, staring blindly at a crack in the linoleum floor. Dad must be thrilled. He is. We're all going to be set. Sarah grabbed her tote, having extracted the only thing she came for: superiority. Anyway, I have a tasting for the caterer. Try to air this place out, will you? Drive safe, I said. She left. The silence crashed back into the apartment, heavy and thick. I dumped the remaining tea into the sink and watched the brown liquid swirl down the drain. The next afternoon, the illusion of my safety was tested. I was walking out of my dreary office building, pulling my coat tight against the bitter wind, when a sleek black town car idled at the curb. The tinted back window rolled down with a soft, mechanical hum. Dominic was sitting inside the glowing screen of a laptop, illuminating the sharp, predatory angles of his face. Claire, he called out. His voice was warm, loud enough to cut through the street noise, but intimate enough to feel like a secret. Do you need a ride? It's freezing. I stopped on the pavement. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. The last time I had been in a car with him, he had been leaning over me, his hand resting casually on the steering wheel, while I choked on my own blood. I forced my muscles to unclench. I walked to the edge of the curb and bent slightly to look in the window, keeping my expression perfectly blank. No thank you, Dominic. The subway is just a block away. His dark eyes studied me. The charm was still painted on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, calculating machines. Sarah tells me you had a health scare and that you missed out on the investment window. Just bad timing, I said, offering a weak, self-deprecating chuckle. I wouldn't want to drag your portfolio down with my pennies anyway. He tilted his head, searching my face for a crack for a lie, for the threat he instinctually felt but couldn't locate. I gave him nothing. I slouched my shoulders, made myself smaller, dimmer. A background character. Well, Dominic said softly, the corner of his mouth ticking up into a genuine, chilling smirk. Take care of yourself, Claire. You too, Dominic, I replied. Take good care of Sarah. The window rolled up. The town car pulled away, its red taillights bleeding into the gray afternoon. I stood in the freezing wind, a hard, feral smile finally breaking across my face. Take everything they have, I thought. Take it all. Dust motes danced in the harsh, late afternoon sunlight, filtering through my parents' living room window. It was late December, and the house smelled aggressively of pine needles and cinnamon potpourri, a synthetic sweetness that coated the back of my tongue. My mother had gone all out for Sarah's impromptu engagement party. She had hired a local catering company, insisted on real florist centerpieces, and bought a new cocktail dress she absolutely could not afford. But affordability was a concept that had evaporated from this house the moment Dominic walked through the front door. I stood in the corner of the room nursing a plastic cup of ginger ale. The carbonation popped faintly against my upper lip. I was wearing an old gray sweater, deliberately fading into the taupe wallpaper, watching the tragedy unfold with the clinical detachment of a mortician. David, you absolutely must try these crab puffs, my mother trilled, practically shoving a silver tray into my father's chest. My father waved her off, his face flushed. It wasn't the alcohol. It was the intoxicating, feverish high of perceived wealth. He was holding court by the fireplace with two of his golfing buddies, gesturing wildly with a half-empty tumbler of scotch. I'm telling you, it's a closed circuit. Dad was bragging, his voice carrying over the low hum of jazz music. Dominic secured me a spot in the primary tranche. You wouldn't believe the quarterly projections. It makes my old mutual funds look like a child's piggy bank. One of his friends, a cautious man named Robert, frowned into his drink. I don't know, Dave. Guaranteed 20% returns in this market. It sounds a little too good to be true. Who is the underwriter? In the old timeline, I had jumped on Robert's skepticism. I had eagerly joined the conversation, armed with printed articles about Ponzi schemes and unregulated offshore accounts. I had tried to build a coalition of sanity, and my father had humiliated me, calling me a bitter, small-minded girl who couldn't stand to see her family succeed. This time, I took a slow sip of my ginger ale. I let the silence stretch. It's proprietary. Dominic's smooth, buttery voice slid into the conversation. He materialized from the hallway, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal sports coat. He clapped a hand on my father's shoulder, a gesture of faux intimacy that made my stomach churn. We leverage discrepancies in emerging market currencies. It's not something retail brokers understand, which is exactly why the yields are so aggressive. He smiled at Robert. It was a weaponized smile. Warm, confident, lightly patronizing. But it's certainly not for everyone. You need a strong stomach for the initial illiquidity. Dad immediately puffed out his chest, desperate to prove his stomach was strong enough. Exactly. You have to spend money to make money. I just moved the rest of the equity from the house into the second phase. My throat clicked as I swallowed. The house equity. He had done it faster this time. Dominic's psychological manipulation was accelerating, likely because I wasn't there to throw sand in the gears. My parents were entirely liquid, and Dominic was holding the bucket. A sharp, familiar ache bloomed behind my ribs. It was a phantom memory of the steering wheel crushing my chest. I looked at my father's aging face, the deep lines around his eyes, the thinning gray hair. A wave of profound, suffocating guilt threatened to pull me under. They were my parents. Despite everything, despite their blatant favoritism and their cruelty in the past life, they were walking into a slaughterhouse. I gripped my plastic cup until the sides buckled with a sharp crack. Dominic's head swiveled. His dark, predatory eyes locked onto me across the room. He excused himself from the men and glided toward me, parting the small crowd of party guests effortlessly. "Claire," he said, stopping just inches from my personal space. He smelled of expensive cedarwood cologne and peppermint. "You're hiding in the corner. Not enjoying the celebration. Just taking a breather," I replied, my voice a dull, uninteresting hum. "It's a lovely party." "Your father is a very brave man," Dominic murmured, keeping his eyes fixed on my face. He was probing again, looking for the leak. "Not many men his age are willing to pivot their entire financial strategy." "He trusts you," I said simply. I met his gaze, forcing my eyes to remain wide cow-like and utterly void of suspicion. "Sarah is so happy. That's all that matters to him." Dominic tilted his head. A tiny furrow appeared between his immaculate brows. I was a puzzle piece that didn't fit his usual picture. Scammers expect greedy accomplices or loud, aggressive detractors. They don't know what to do with apathetic compliance. "And you?" he asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't you want a piece of the pie? Sarah mentioned you came into a little money. It's a shame you locked it away." "I'm afraid of risk," I lied, offering him a self-deprecating shrug. "I like my little spreadsheets. I like knowing exactly where my pennies are." Dominic let out a short, dismissive breath. The tension bled out of his shoulders. He had categorized me pathetic, cowardly, useless. "Well, we need worker bees in the world, too." He turned and walked back to Sarah, who was holding court by the hors d'oeuvres, flashing her fake diamond at her jealous friends. I watched his retreating back. Worker bee. I thought the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. Keep thinking that. I stepped out onto the back porch, letting the freezing winter air shock my system. The sky was a bruised, heavy purple. Snow was coming. I leaned against the icy wooden railing, wrapping my arms around myself. I had to hold the line. I had to let them fall. Because, if I warned them, I would die again. And this time, I intended to outlive them all. Frost crept up the edges of the boutique's floor-to-ceiling windows, thick and crystalline, blurring the busy downtown traffic into smears of gray and red. It was late February. The honeymoon phase of the scam was beginning to rot. I sat on a velvet-tufted sofa that smelled faintly of sterile fabric cleaner and expensive perfume. In front of me, Sarah was standing on a circular pedestal swathed in layers of ivory silk and French lace. "Oh, I think this is the one," Sarah breathed, staring at her reflection in the gilded floor mirror. Her cheeks were flushed, but not with the effortless glow she'd had a few months ago. There was a tight, frantic energy radiating from her now. Her eyes were slightly sunken, and she was chewing on the inside of her lip, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. The bridal consultant, a sleek woman in black, clapped her hands. "It's stunning on you. With the alterations, we're looking at around 12,000. Shall we ring it up?" Sarah hesitated, a microscopic pause, but to me it was as loud as a gunshot. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice a pitch too high. "Put it on the platinum card. She dug into her designer purse, her manicured nails scraping frantically against the leather interior. She handed the heavy metal card to the consultant, who whisked it away to the front register. I flipped through a bridal magazine on my lap, pretending to read an article about floral arrangements. My heart was beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my sternum. I knew what was coming. I had lived this month before. In the previous timeline, this was the week the first distribution check from Dominic's offshore syndicate was supposed to clear. My father had been expecting a massive payout. Instead, he got an email about a temporary freeze due to international banking regulations. It was the standard stall tactic, the stringing along before the ghosting. Dominic is going to cry when he sees me in this, Sarah said, though she was looking at the floor, not the mirror. He's been so stressed lately. He's in Dubai right now. Or maybe it was Zurich. His itinerary is crazy. It must be hard having him away, I murmured, turning a glossy page. It is, but he's finalizing the big payout for Dad, so it's worth it. She laughed a brittle, sharp sound. Dad's been practically vibrating all week waiting for the wire transfer. The consultant returned. Her professional, obsequious smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, uncomfortable grimace. She held the platinum card out between two fingers. I'm so sorry, Sarah, the woman said softly, glancing at me as if I were an intruder. It declined. Sarah froze. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking sallow and sick. That's impossible. Try it again. It's a no-limit card. I did try it twice, ma'am. It's coming up as a hard decline. Bank hold. It's a mistake. Sarah snapped, her voice turning vicious. She snatched the card back. Dominic's firm manages this account. They probably flagged it for fraud because it's a large purchase. Just put the dress on hold. I need to make a phone call. Sarah practically leapt off the pedestal, gathering the heavy silk skirts in her fists and storming toward the dressing room. I remained on the velvet sofa. I didn't offer to pay. I didn't offer comfort. I just sat in the quiet, sterile air of the boutique, listening to the muffled, frantic sounds of my sister dialing her phone behind the heavy velvet curtain. Ring, ring, ring. Pick up, Dom, come on, I heard her hiss. Then the inevitable beep of a generic voicemail box. I closed the bridal magazine and set it neatly on the glass coffee table. The silence in the boutique felt absolute, broken only by the ragged sound of Sarah's breathing from the dressing room. The collapse wasn't going to be an explosion. It was going to be a slow, agonizing suffocation. Dominic was already draining the accounts, moving the assets into untraceable crypto wallets or offshore shells. The platinum card declining was just the first warning light on the dashboard. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from my father. Dad, Claire, have you heard from Sarah today? Can't get a hold of Dominic. The bank says the routing number he gave me for the distribution is invalid. Probably just a typo, but I need to reach him. I stared at the glowing screen. The words blurred slightly as a strange, dark cocktail of emotions washed over me. Pity, horror, and a cold, terrifying sense of vindication. They had chosen him. They had looked at my years of loyalty, my cautious warnings in the past life, and they had chosen the shiny, empty promises of a predator. They had thrown me to the wolves. Now the wolves were at their door. I typed a reply, my thumbs moving steadily over the glass screen. Claire, I'm with Sarah now. She can't reach him either. I'm sure it's just a typo, Dad. Don't worry. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and waited for my sister to emerge from the dressing room to face the ruins of her life. Burnt coffee. That was the smell of financial ruin. It hung in the air of my parents' kitchen, bitter and exhausted, clinging to the floral wallpaper and the pale yellow curtains my mother had washed every spring since I was 10. I sat at the laminate island, tracing a shallow groove in the surface with my thumbnail. It was early March. The frost outside was beginning to thaw, turning the front lawn into a muddy brown swamp, but inside the house, a deep, paralyzing freeze had set in. My father was pacing. He didn't look like the man who had confidently swaggered through the engagement party 3 months ago. His skin had taken on a grayish, waxy pallor, sagging heavily around his jawline. He was wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he'd had on yesterday, the collar unbuttoned, a faint yellow sweat stain blooming under the arms. In his right hand, he clutched his smartphone like it was a live grenade. "It's just compliance," Dad muttered to no one in particular. His voice was a thin, reedy rasp. "International compliance. The Patriot Act anti-money laundering. It flags large transfers. Dominic explained this. He said this could happen." My mother stood by the sink, mechanically scrubbing a pan that was already clean. The rhythmic shh, shh of the steel wool against Teflon set my teeth on edge. She hadn't put on makeup in a week. The sharp, disapproving matriarch, who usually judged my clothing choices, was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed woman who jumped every time a car drove past the window. "Of course he did. David," Mom said quietly, her voice trembling. She didn't look at him. She just kept scrubbing. "He's a professional. We just have to wait." I took a slow sip of the terrible scorched coffee. It coated my tongue in ash. A sharp, jagged shard of guilt twisted in my gut. It was a physical pain, heavy and suffocating. These were my parents. They had raised me, fed me, bandaged my scraped knees. Watching them slowly rot from the inside out was agonizing. I could feel the desperate urge rising in my throat to scream the truth, to grab my father by his shaking shoulders and tell him it was a lie that Dominic was bleeding him dry. But then I blinked, and the memory of cold rain against a shattered windshield washed over me. I remembered the sharp metallic taste of my own blood. I remembered my father standing in the hospital room in my previous life, refusing to look at me, telling the police that I must have been driving recklessly because I was so upset about Sarah's wedding. He had protected Dominic even then. Even over my dead body, the guilt hardened into something cold and brittle. I swallowed the coffee. "Did Dominic say how long the compliance hold lasts?" I asked. My tone was mild, laced with just enough naive curiosity to sound harmless. Dad stopped pacing. He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He looked like a cornered animal trying to remember how to bite. "A few weeks, a month, it depends on the SEC. But he sent me the paperwork to expedite it." He slapped his phone onto the kitchen counter and scrubbed his hands over his face, pressing his palms into his eye sockets until his knuckles turned white. "The only problem," Dad whispered, his voice cracking, "is the tariff. To release the funds from the offshore escrow, the receiving party, that's me, has to pay the tax burden up front. It's standard procedure." "How much is the tax?" I asked softly. 50,000, Mom blurted out. She dropped the steel wool. It landed in the soapy water with a dull, pathetic plop. She finally turned to look at me, her face pale, her lips trembling. $50,000, Claire, and he needs it wired to a clearinghouse in Malta by Friday, or the entire portfolio gets locked in probate for 3 years. The sunk cost trap. The final brutal squeeze before the ghosting. Dominic was brilliant in the most parasitic way imaginable. He had drained their savings, leveraged their home equity, and now, knowing they were panicked, he was offering them a lifeline that required them to bleed just a little bit more. "We can get it," Dad said, his voice rising, gaining a manic, desperate volume. "I spoke to the guys at the lodge. Robert is out the coward. But I can take a bridge loan against the life insurance policies, and Sarah has her wedding fund. We just need to pool it. Once the transfer clears, we'll have $5 million in liquid assets. 50 grand is a drop in the bucket. He was shouting now, trying to convince himself by sheer volume. The front door slammed shut, the heavy thud echoing through the silent, tense house. A moment later, Sarah walked into the kitchen. She looked awful. Her perfectly highlighted hair was tied back in a messy, greasy knot. She was wearing expensive designer sweatpants, but they hung loosely on her frame. The arrogant glow of the bride-to-be was completely extinguished. "Sarah?" Dad said, lunging toward her, grabbing her forearms. "Did you talk to him? Did Dominic call you back?" Sarah pulled her arms away, her face twisting into an ugly defensive sneer. "No, Dad, I didn't. His assistant said he's in a boardroom in Geneva and can't have his phone. Stop suffocating me about it." "I'm not suffocating you." Dad yelled back, a spray of spittle hitting the counter. "I'm trying to save our lives. If we don't wire that tariff by Friday, we lose the house, Sarah. We lose everything. Then find the money." Sarah screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. Tears spilled over her lower lashes, ruining her mascara. "You're the man of the house, figure it out. Dominic is doing everything he can. He's working himself to death for us, and you're panicking over a stupid tax fee." She turned her furious, tear-streaked face toward me. I was sitting perfectly still, my hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. "And you," Sarah hissed, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "Sitting there judging us. You have that money from Grandma. Don't tell me you spent $30,000 on medical bills, Claire. I know you're lying. You always hoard your money." I looked up at her. In the past life, this was the exact moment she had thrown my meticulous investigative file in my face. The moment she had condemned me. "I don't have it, Sarah," I said smoothly, my voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "I'm sorry, I really am." Sarah stared at me, her chest heaving. For a second, I saw a flicker of pure, unadulterated hatred in her eyes. It was the look of someone drowning, realizing the only piece of driftwood nearby was covered in spikes. She spun on her heel and stormed out of the kitchen. I looked back at my father. He was staring blindly out the window at the muddy lawn, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the counter to stay upright. The slaughterhouse doors had closed behind them, and they still thought they were just waiting for a train. Wind rattled the loose pane of glass in my living room window, a persistent rhythmic tapping that sounded like bony fingers drumming against the sill. It was late April. The promised spring had finally arrived, bringing heavy gray rainstorms that washed the city in a perpetual depressing twilight. My apartment buzzer didn't ring. There was only a heavy, frantic knocking at my actual door. I set my laptop on the coffee table. I had been scrolling through real estate listings in another state, quietly planning my exit strategy. I walked to the door, looked through the peephole and sighed. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Sarah stood in the hallway. She looked like a ghost. Her skin was sallow bruised with deep purple circles under her eyes. She was wearing a trench coat over pajamas, her feet shoved into expensive loafers that were completely ruined by the puddles outside. She didn't smell like gardenias anymore. She smelled like stale sweat panic and cheap wine. "Let me in," she demanded, though her voice lacked its usual commanding sting. It was a raspy croak. I stepped aside. She shuffled past me, dripping rainwater onto the scuffed floorboards. She didn't complain about the smell of cabbage. She didn't look at my cheap furniture. She just collapsed onto the center cushion of my secondhand sofa, dropping her head into her hands. "He's gone," she whispered. The words hung in the quiet apartment. I closed the door, turning the deadbolt with a soft, definitive click. I leaned against the heavy wood, crossing my arms over my chest. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I just felt a profound, heavy emptiness. Who? I asked, playing my part to the very end. Dominic. Sarah dragged her hands down her face, pulling the skin taut, revealing the sharp, starved angles of her cheekbones. His number is disconnected. The website for his firm, it just says error 404. Dad tried to call the escrow office in Malta, but the bank said the routing number belonged to a defunct shell company in the Caymans. The money is gone, Claire. She looked up at me, her eyes wide glassy and completely feral with terror. Dad took a high-interest loan from some horrible lender downtown to pay the tax tariff. He put the cars up for collateral. They came and towed Mom's SUV this morning. I pushed off the door and walked slowly to the armchair opposite the sofa. I sat down, keeping my posture relaxed, my expression a careful mask of shocked sympathy. Sarah, I don't understand. I lied softly. Dominic is your fiancé. Why would he do that? Because he's a liar. She shrieked, her voice echoing off the bare walls. She leapt up from the sofa, pacing the tiny room like a trapped animal. It was all a lie. The ring is fake. I took it to a jeweler yesterday. It's moissanite. He emptied our accounts, Claire. He ruined us. She stopped pacing and turned to me. The panic in her eyes suddenly hardened, shifting violently into a desperate, calculating greed. She dropped to her knees in front of my chair, grabbing my knees with her cold, wet hands. You have to help us! Sarah begged, her fingers digging painfully into my jeans. You have your savings. I know you do. You have to give it to Dad. If he misses the first payment on this bridge loan, they're going to foreclose on the house in 30 days. You have to save them. I looked down at her. My beautiful, arrogant sister, kneeling on my cheap rug, begging for the very money she had once mocked me for saving. I told you, Sarah, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The money is gone. Stop lying, she screamed, her nails biting into my skin. You're just doing this to punish me? You've always been jealous of me? You couldn't stand that I found someone like Dominic, so you're sitting here enjoying this. You want to see us homeless. I stared at her. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her narcissism was a marvel to witness. Even now, buried under the wreckage of a scam she brought into our home, she was making herself the victim of my imaginary jealousy. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my knees. I stood up, towering over her. I warned you about him, I said. Sarah froze on the floor. She looked up at me, confused. What? No, you didn't. You never said a word. She was right. In this timeline, I hadn't. But the truth bled through anyway, a confession to the ghost of the girl who had died on Devil's Peak. I told you to be careful. I continued, staring down at her, my voice turning to ice. I told you to look closely, but you didn't want to see. You wanted the shiny things. You wanted to feel superior. You sold Dad out for a fake diamond and a lie. How can you say that? She sobbed, burying her face in her hands. He tricked us. He tricked Dad. Dominic didn't trick Dad, I said coldly. Dominic just showed Dad a mirror. He used Dad's own greed against him. You all jumped into the fire because you were too busy looking at the gold at the bottom of the pit. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the cold, damp hallway air rush in. You need to leave, Sarah, I said. She stayed on the floor for a long minute, her shoulders shaking with pathetic, ragged sobs. When she finally realized I wasn't going to comfort her, she dragged herself up. She looked at me with a hatred so pure, so absolute, it almost made me smile. "You're a monster," she whispered as she walked past me into the hall. "They're your parents, and you're letting them die." "Drive safe," I said softly. I shut the door. I walked to the window and watched the rain wash the grime off the glass. The silence in the apartment was absolute. I had won. I was safe. But as I stood there, in the quiet gloom, tasting the stale coffee on the back of my tongue, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. Revenge doesn't fix the broken things inside you. It just makes you comfortable living in the dark. Cardboard boxes have a distinct dry smell. It's the scent of old paper, stagnant air, and profound defeat. It was late May, and the humidity in my parents' house was stifling. The air conditioning had been shut off a week ago. Utility companies don't care about offshore bank fraud or broken engagements. They only care about routing numbers that actually work. I stood in the foyer, my sneakers sticking slightly to the hardwood floor where a Persian rug used to lie. The rug was gone. Sold to a liquidator along with the antique grandfather clock and the dining room chandelier. The house was being hollowed out piece by piece, just like the people inside it. I walked into the kitchen. My mother Beatrice was wrapping a chipped porcelain gravy boat in yesterday's newspaper. Her hands, usually manicured and steady, shook violently. The skin around her knuckles was raw, stripped of its natural oils from days of scrubbing baseboards in a desperate, irrational attempt to make the house look presentable for the bank's foreclosure inspectors. "You don't have to wrap that, Mom," I said softly, stepping over a pile of black trash bags. "The liquidators won't take chipped porcelain." My mother didn't look up. She kept wrapping, her movements jerky and robotic. She was wearing a faded cotton blouse with a noticeable coffee stain on the collar. The matriarch, who had spent my entire childhood curating an image of upper-middle-class perfection, was completely gone. "It belongs in the set," she muttered, her voice raspy from disuse. "The set has to be complete. If it's not complete, they'll say we ruined it." "Mom!" I reached out and gently placed my hand over hers, stopping the frantic crinkling of the newspaper. Her skin was freezing despite the sweltering heat of the kitchen. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were vacant, glassy pools of shock. She didn't have the energy to resent me anymore. The anger she had harbored when Sarah told her I had refused to bail them out had burned off weeks ago, leaving only a brittle layer of ash. "Your father is in the garage," she whispered, looking past my shoulder at the empty living room. "He's looking for the title to the lawnmower. He thinks the pawn shop down on 4th Street will give him $200 for it." A sour taste flooded my mouth. $200. 3 months ago, this man was shouting about a $5 million liquid asset portfolio. He had sneered at my savings. Now he was digging through a sweltering garage to pawn garden equipment just to buy groceries. I let go of her hands and walked toward the side door. The garage was an oven. Dust motes hung thick in the air, illuminated by the harsh yellow shafts of sunlight piercing through the cracks in the automated door, which no longer worked. My father was sitting on an overturned plastic bucket. He wasn't looking for the lawnmower title. He was just sitting there staring at the oil stains on the concrete floor. He looked 10 years older. His hair, previously a distinguished salt and pepper, was pure, dull white. He had lost weight, his shoulders caving inward, his spine bowed as if an invisible foot was pressing down on his neck. "Dad," I said. He didn't jump. He just slowly rotated his head. When he saw me, a flicker of something wet and pathetic pooled in his eyes. Shame. Absolute crushing shame. "Claire," he rasped. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. You shouldn't be here. The dust. It's not good for your lungs. You had that shadow. My chest tightened. It was a bizarre, twisted defense mechanism. He was clinging to the lie I had told about my medical bills because it was the only way he could process my refusal to give him my money. If I was sick, I was excused. If I was healthy and just refused to save him, the reality of his own foolishness would completely break him. I'm fine, Dad, I said, leaning against the doorframe. The wood felt rough through my thin t-shirt. Have you heard from the lawyer? He let out a dry, hacking laugh that sounded like sandpaper rubbing together. Lawyers cost retainers, Claire. We spoke to a public defender for advice. He said it's gone. The money was routed through 3 different crypto exchanges before it even hit Malta. The FBI took a report, but they practically laughed. They see 10 of these a week. He looked down at his trembling hands. I signed the papers, Claire. I signed the house away. I signed my retirement away. For a kid in a nice suit. I crossed my arms, digging my fingernails into my own biceps to ground myself. Part of me, the part that remembered the agonizing crunch of my ribs on Devil's Peak, wanted to nod. I wanted to tell him that this was the price of arrogance, that he had ignored my warnings in the past life, and this was his karma. But looking at the broken, hollowed-out shell of a man sitting on a bucket in a sweltering garage, the victory tasted like bile. There was no poetry in this justice. It was just ugly. It was just sad. Where is Sarah? I asked, changing the subject. My father's jaw clenched. A muscle ticked rapidly under his eye. She left. Yesterday. Packed a suitcase of her designer clothes and called a friend. She said she couldn't stay in this house anymore. Said the stress was giving her a rash. He let out a shuddering breath, burying his face in his grimy palms. She didn't even say goodbye to your mother. She just left. The golden child. The one they had sacrificed everything for. The moment the gold turned to lead, she had abandoned them. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out a thick white envelope. I walked over to the bucket and dropped it onto his lap. He flinched, looking down at it. What is this? It's $3,000 in cash, I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. It's enough for a deposit on a cheap rental apartment and a month of groceries. Do not put it in a bank. Do not tell Sarah you have it. Find a place for you and Mom before the sheriff comes to change the locks next week. He stared at the envelope. His hands hovered over it, shaking violently. Then he broke. A loud, ugly, tearing sob ripped out of his throat. He hunched over, clutching the envelope to his chest, weeping with the total, uninhibited abandonment of a child. I didn't touch him. I didn't offer a comforting word. I just turned my back, walked out of the sweltering garage, and left him to cry in the dark. Hospitals always freeze the blood in my veins. The smell hits you first, a sterile, terrifying cocktail of industrial bleach rubbing alcohol and old burnt coffee. Then comes the sound. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished linoleum, the muffled pages over the intercom, and the rhythmic, relentless beep of cardiac monitors. It was early July. I sat in a plastic chair in the waiting room of St. Jude's emergency wing. The chair was hard digging into my lower back, but I barely registered the discomfort. My eyes were fixed on the double doors leading to the trauma bay. This was the exact hospital where I had died in the previous timeline. I could almost feel the ghost of my past self, lying in one of those backroom's tubes shoved down my throat, bleeding out from internal injuries, while Sarah complained in the hallway about how my accident was ruining her wedding schedule. My phone buzzed in my lap. I ignored it. I had been sitting here for 4 hours. At 6 a.m., my mother had called me from the cramped 2-bedroom apartment I had helped them secure. She was hysterical. My father had collapsed in the kitchen while making oatmeal. Massive myocardial infarction, a widowmaker heart attack brought on by 3 months of absolute crushing cortisol and stress. The double doors swung open, and a doctor in blue scrubs walked out. He looked exhausted, rubbing the bridge of his nose beneath his wire-rimmed glasses. He scanned the nearly empty waiting room. Family of David. I stood up. My knees popped loudly in the quiet room. I'm his daughter. The doctor walked over. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He gave me the professional detached look of someone who delivers bad news for a living. We've stabilized him. We had to put a stent in his left anterior descending artery. It was a severe blockage. He's going to be in the ICU for a few days, and his recovery is going to be incredibly slow. But he's alive, I said. It wasn't a question. He is, but his heart muscle sustained significant damage. The doctor hesitated, lowering his voice. Has your father been under unusual stress lately? His blood pressure markers are consistent with someone in a chronic, severe state of panic. I let out a short, humorless exhale. You could say that. He lost everything a few months ago. The doctor gave a sympathetic, grim nod. He had clearly heard this story before. I see. Well, the social worker will come by to discuss Medicare and payment plans. He's going to need a lot of medication and absolute rest. Another shock to his system could be fatal. Thank you, doctor. He walked away. I sat back down in the hard plastic chair, staring at the scuffed floor. The medical bills from this alone would bankrupt them all over again. It was a cascading failure. Dominic hadn't just taken their money. He had taken my father's physical health, my mother's sanity, and whatever fragile threads kept this family bound together. The heavy entrance doors of the waiting room slid open with a mechanical hiss. I looked up. Sarah was standing there. She was unrecognizable. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a cheap, wrinkled sundress and scuffed sandals. Her hair, which used to require $300 a month to maintain, was split and pulled back into a messy claw clip. But it was her face that shocked me the most. The arrogant, untouchable smirk was completely eradicated. She looked hollow-aged and terrified. She spotted me and walked over her steps hesitant. She didn't sit down. She stood over me, wringing her hands together. Mom called me, Sarah whispered. Her voice was thin. Is Dad going to die? No, I said, leaning my head back against the wall, watching her with cold, clinical detachment. They put a stent in. He's in the ICU. Sarah let out a breath and slumped into the chair next to me. She dropped her head into her hands. God, this is a nightmare. It's a never-ending nightmare. She smelled faintly of stale cigarettes. In the old timeline, she despised smoking. The stress was eating her alive just like it was eating my father. Have you found a job, Sarah? I asked, my tone conversational, like we were discussing the weather. She flinched. I'm working the front desk at a dental office. It barely pays minimum wage. I had to sell my car just to make rent on my studio. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with fresh tears. Claire, I can't do this. I don't know how to live like this. Every time my phone rings, I think it's a debt collector. I think it's the police. The police aren't looking for you, I said flatly. You didn't commit the fraud. But I brought him into the house. She practically screamed, drawing a sharp look from the triage nurse behind the glass partition. Sarah lowered her voice, dropping her face back into her hands. I brought him to Dad. It's my fault. It's all my fault. I sat in the sterile, freezing air of the hospital, listening to my sister finally confess. It was the moment I had dreamed of in my past life. The moment of accountability. The vindication. I had wanted her to break. I had wanted her to realize what she had done to us. But as I looked at her shaking shoulders, I felt nothing but a cold, heavy exhaustion. You didn't pull the trigger, Sarah, I said softly, staring at the flickering fluorescent light overhead. You just handed him the gun. Dad aimed it at himself. Sarah slowly raised her head. She looked at me, her face pale and streaked with mascara. Why are you so calm? How can you sit there and be so calm while our whole world is ending? I slowly turned my head to meet her gaze. My eyes were flat, mirroring the deadness inside my own chest. Because my world ended a long time ago, I whispered. I'm just watching the rest of you catch up. Frost coated the edges of my windshield, a thin, glittering lace that cracked under the aggressive scrape of my plastic ice tool. It was late November. Exactly 1 year since the pot roast dinner. Exactly 1 year since I had sat across from a predator and decided to let him eat my family alive. I tossed the scraper into the passenger seat and climbed into my freezing sedan. The engine turned over with a pathetic metallic whine before settling into a rough idle. I blew onto my cupped hands, watching my breath plume in the frigid cabin air. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. A news alert. I didn't need to look at the screen to know what it said. The trial had concluded yesterday. Dominic, whose real name turned out to be Gregory Miller, a twice-convicted con artist from a dying coal town in Pennsylvania, had been sentenced to 85 years in federal prison for orchestrating a multi-million-dollar wire fraud syndicate. He hadn't just ruined my parents. He had decimated 36 families across the eastern seaboard. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. The subsidized apartment complex where my parents now lived was a brutalist concrete block on the wrong side of the river. It smelled permanently of damp plaster, stale tobacco, and cheap cooking oil. I parked in the visitor lot, grabbed the heavy canvas bags of groceries from the back seat, and made the trek up 3 flights of concrete stairs because the elevator had been broken since August. I knocked twice on door 3B, my mother answered. Beatrice looked like a brittle dried leaf. She was wearing a moth-eaten cardigan over a faded nightgown, her hair completely white and thinning at the scalp. She didn't smile when she saw me. She just stepped aside, her slippers shuffling a dull rhythm against the peeling linoleum floor. I brought the low-sodium soup Dad likes, I said, my voice quiet, stepping into the cramped, suffocatingly hot apartment. The radiator hissed in the corner, leaking a steady drip of rusty water into a warped plastic Tupperware container. Put it on the counter, Mom rasped, not looking at me. She shuffled back to her spot on the sagging tweed sofa. My father was in a medical recliner by the window, an oxygen cannula wrapped over his ears, the clear plastic prongs resting in his nose. The machine beside him chugged with a heavy rhythmic thud. He was watching the small boxy television resting on a milk crate across the room. The local news anchor was talking about Gregory Miller. They showed a courtroom sketch. Even in rough charcoal, the artist had captured that devastating, practiced smirk. I set the groceries down and began putting the cans in the bare pantry. The silence in the room was heavier than the stifling humidity. It was the silence of a graveyard. They said restitution is impossible. Dad suddenly spoke. His voice was a wet, raspy wheeze that made my own throat ache. The prosecutor called this morning. The money is gone. He funneled it all through unregulated offshore tumblers. We're never getting a single dime back. I paused, a cold can of black beans heavy in my palm. I'm sorry, Dad. It was a hollow apology, and we both knew it. I wasn't sorry the money was gone. I was just tired of watching the fallout. The front door unlocked with a metallic clatter. Sarah walked in. She was wearing a navy blue polo shirt with the logo of a discount pharmacy chain embroidered on the breast pocket. Her hands, which used to sport $200 manicures, were dry, and cracked, the nails bitten down to the quick. She stopped in the narrow entryway, seeing me by the kitchen counter. We hadn't spoken since the hospital waiting room 4 months ago. Sarah looked from me to the bags of groceries I had bought to the oxygen tank, keeping our father alive. A myriad of emotions crossed her exhausted face: resentment, profound shame, and a desperate, agonizing longing for the life she had carelessly thrown away. But the anger was gone. The fiery, arrogant narcissism that had defined my sister for 28 years had been completely snuffed out. "They sentenced him," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw," I replied simply. She walked slowly to the kitchen island, dropping her cheap plastic purse onto the laminate. She looked down at her bare left hand. The phantom weight of a fake diamond still haunted her ring finger. "I thought—" Sarah swallowed hard, a tear spilling over her lashes and cutting a clean line down her dusty cheek. "I thought if they put him in a cage, I would feel better. I thought it would fix it. But it doesn't change anything, does it? We're still here." "No," I said, folding the empty canvas bags. "It doesn't change anything." I walked past her, the smell of her cheap pharmacy uniform, a depressing mix of rubbing alcohol and stale cardboard filling the narrow space. I had done my duty. Every week I brought the groceries. Every month, I anonymously paid the electric bill so Dad's oxygen machine wouldn't shut off. I had kept them from starving, but I refused to save them. Because saving them meant sacrificing myself, and I had already paid that price once before. I couldn't stay in this tomb any longer. The air was too thin, choked by the ghosts of their own greed. "Claire." My father wheezed from his chair. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. "If you had known—" Dad asked, his voice trembling with a pathetic, desperate need for an absolution I would never give him. "If you had seen the signs, would you have warned us?" I looked over my shoulder. I looked at the man who had traded his family's security for a greedy fantasy. I looked at the sister who had happily offered me up as a sacrifice for a sociopath's approval. I looked at the mother who had watched it all happen and blamed me for the blood on the floor. My chest was perfectly whole. The phantom pains of crushed ribs and punctured lungs, the ghosts of my previous timeline, were finally gone. I was breathing clean air. "No, Dad." I said softly, the truth slipping out like a quiet exhale. "I wouldn't have." I turned. The knob stepped out into the freezing, sterile hallway and closed the door on my past life forever. If you were gripped by Claire's dark, unapologetic journey of survival and karma, hit the like button right now. Share this story with someone who appreciates a raw, realistic protagonist who refuses to play the martyr. Subscribe to the channel for more intense first-person Reborn dramas. Tell me in the comments, was Claire's ultimate silence justified, or did the punishment outweigh the crime?